Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you that for updates on the show, be sure to follow me on Twitter at OmerQ _. Again, that's at OMERQ _. And if you like the show, please consider supporting it by subscribing on Apple Podcasts or following the show on Spotify so that you get notified when a new episode is released. Also, be sure to send it to your friends. We don't ask you to give us money, just support the show by helping it grow. Just a few easy clicks. That's all it takes. It doesn't cost you a dime, and you can do it in no time. So please consider doing that, and let's get to the show. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Omer, and today we're going to be talking about political reform and looking at politics beyond just the 2020 election. Joining me to do that is the co-founder of Common Sense Strategies and a political reform activist, Jared Alper. Jared, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
Happy to have you on, Jared. Let's get started by just talking about our brief history, because once upon a time, you were my boss, or I worked for you on the Neil Simon for U.S. Senate campaign. And for those of you who don't know, Neil Simon was an independent candidate in 2018 who ran for Senate against incumbent Ben Cardin. And it was a very interesting experience. You don't get a lot of experiences like that in politics, where you're kind of running as an outsider candidate in a very, let's just be real about it. Maryland's over 60% Democrat in presidential elections. They're a very Democratic, heavily Democratic state. So
Yes.
Going into that, it was a very unique experience. And Ben Bernbach, I had on the show earlier, and we talked about kind of things from our point of view. And I'm actually interested to get your point of view. So why don't you tell us things from your perspective on the campaign and what actually made the campaign so special?
Yeah, it was an incredibly idealistic campaign for a lot of reasons. I think, and this was sort of, I came on in January 2018, and at the time, it was me and Lindsay, who you remember, and Neil, and we were working out of his house for the first maybe 2.5, 3 months of the campaign. And it was the first time I had done a national, a race for federal office where there wasn't an established sort of, you didn't have a party affiliation, you didn't have any sort of infrastructure to go into other than Neil's network. And maybe, to an extent, the United American network, though it wasn't super developed. And so in a sense, it was really idealistic because you had to think about how to build a coalition and then actually go out and execute building that, of which you and a lot of the other fellows were a huge piece of, and also were sort of the building blocks of. And it was an idealistic experience in that you had to wake up every day and say, how do we get to this coalition that we think exists? We know that there is a demand for reform. We were running against, like you said, Ben Cardin, who had been in elected office at varying layers on the totem poles. I think the same year the Beatles played Shea Stadium for the first time in 1964. So he's not exactly a poster child for, new energy and new ideas. And that's what we were staking our claim to. It wasn't about continuing the status quo of Democrat or Republican or conservative or liberal. It was about finding common ground, bringing people together, and doing it in a way that was wholly different from the two-party duopoly of which we saw Republican senators, Democratic senators as the same side of the coin. And I think we're seeing some juice for that idea. I mean, there's always going to be this demand for improvement. I think you see poll after poll after poll. It's been this way since I got involved in politics, which was in 2014. Congressional approval has never really broken up over 20% approval in the last 6 years. So the question is, how do you break that logjam of, so people can't stand the job body of Congress is doing, and yet they reelect incumbents at almost a 96% success rate. And so we were trying to break all of that up and pose an alternative. And I think we all felt that we were super energized by the notion of being surrounded by people who are not of the same ideology and we're coming together purely for that idea.
Yeah.
You and Ben spoke about that, which is
Yeah,
really
yeah.
cool thing.
Yeah, it's like when you would walk into our office every day, you'd walk in, you had someone like, Steve who ran Republican gubernatorial
Mm-hmm.
races. You had someone like yourself. You had people like me who's more
Yeah,
leftist progressive, Ben who's way more libertarian than
yeah,
anyone I ever know. But so and you had like all these people from these different backgrounds, and to me it's kind of what any administration or any campaign or how our government should be, all of
totally.
these different voices, giving opinions, giving the different points of view. So, but you have all of these different ideas coming together and they're kind of being
Yeah.
filtered, and the best ones come out, and the most effective ones, the ones that we know, I think we can all agree on, and ideas that I think we can compromise on, they come out of that. And that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of what we should be working towards. Justin Amash, who is the only libertarian member of Congress, was on
Mm-hmm.
Yang's show earlier this week.
I listened to it yesterday. That was a conversation that, if you've been paying attention to sort of the reform efforts, it was revealing without actually, introducing anything new.
Yeah.
But what he said wasn't unique in that I think a lot of members of Congress say it publicly and privately, maybe a little bit more watered down.
Definitely more watered down in my experience.
Yeah, it's just astonishing that, and this is, again, he's a guy who left his party, was briefly an independent. He left it in opposition to what had happened. I think, in his view, that the party embraced Trump and stopped standing for the principles that he stood for. And to his credit, I think he's a very principled member of Congress.
Yeah, I would argue probably the most principled member, and that's coming from me.
He's a very principled member. He had nothing left to lose because he's leaving Congress.
Mm.
And at the same time, you were kind of just thinking he was almost powerless, and when he admitted it, that there was nothing he could have really done differently. If you're a process person, you'll acknowledge that Amash's point was essentially that you have to fix the structural issues in Congress, open things up, allow people who you disagree with, or people even who you do agree with, to start taking control over the amendment process and start making their ideas heard and voted on. And to me, the big takeaway was that most of these members just don't want it. They don't really want to offer their free thoughts, and they don't want to be put in positions where they have to actually make their opinions plain. It's way easier to follow the leader.
Right. And I think one thing you're seeing with this new breed of these younger congressmen and women who are coming in, and it's not just the moderates, it's also people who are on, even some, they like to say the extremes, like people like the Squad, like AOC, Rashid Tlaib, and them. Even they're coming out against this idea of, hyper partisanship, hyper polarization. And, if you look at Justin Amash, some of the people he works with closely are who? Members of the Squad, AOC. Yeah. They were the members of the Squad were the ones who were actually fighting for Justin Amash to become an impeachment manager when Donald Trump's impeachment was happening, and it was fought very hard by the party and the Democratic caucus. So so those type of things give, I think, a lot of young people who follow this kind of stuff hope. The issue is, though, with all the noise that's going on, with all of the the focusing on Trump, focusing on Biden, focusing on Pelosi and Mitch McConnell and how they can't get a deal done for stimulus, for example, all of that kind of stuff, it just dilutes everything. And you don't hear these people who are working together on policies like ending qualified immunity, common sense stuff that I think any productive government would get passed. You don't see that stuff happening, and you don't hear about it. And that's very concerning for me, because it's something that I think could lead to a huge structural and fundamental change that's needed in this country.
Yeah. I mean, my sort of thinking, and what I agree with Amash on, is that if you open things up and you force members to make their opinions plain, you're going to get a sense for where the common ground is. And I think, you can have people like Amash or AOC who have generally more off the at the end of the spectrum, conservative and liberal type of ideas. And they're able to sort of promote them without actually producing much, because they know that their votes are, the legislation is never really coming to light anyway.
Right.
and amendments aren't getting added. So I would rather see, a Congress where AOC can say, hey, look, I want to do the Green New Deal, and here's an actual piece of legislation that I'm submitting to the general body.
Hmm.
And members will try and fix it and say, hey, look, this doesn't make any sense to us, or this is wildly unpopular amongst the members of Congress. And you eventually arrive at where the middle ground will be amongst the existing body, right? And maybe in a Democratic Congress, the middle ground is more left than right or
Right.
center. In a Republican Congress, it's the opposite. And maybe AOC has to give ground because the Congress she's got is not as liberal as she'd like them to be, right?
Right.
But the point is, you trim, you trim from the layers in towards the middle, and that's the only way things are going to get passed. And maybe it'll take longer, but
Right.
you're also exposing people for what they truly think and how they vote.
Right. And I think when people hear things like the Green New Deal or, Medicare for all or some of these like more extreme kinds of legislation, like to say, when they
Mhm.
hear stuff like that, they automatically get scared because of the way that AOC or Bernie or people like that present it is as, existential threats that we need to address. But there's a reason for that. That's also kind of how legislation works. You present it in your light so that when you actually go to pass it, when you go to like hearings, when you go to work on it with other members of Congress, they can look at it and they can say, okay, so we agree with these points and let's get these passed and let's work
Yeah,
on some of the stuff and come together. Maybe, maybe like net carbon by 2030
sure.
is a little a bit of a stretch. Let's work on 2040 or 2050, something like that, right? And that's something that you can work on, right? And this is actually speaks to a bigger issue. For those of you who follow a lot of reform groups, or
Mhm.
I'm not going to specifically name any particularly, but I think the problem that a lot of political or some political reform groups rather fall into is confusing the way that some of this legislation is presented and
Mhm.
the initial unwillingness to compromise as hyper partisanship when when in reality hyper partisanship doesn't come from freshman members of Congress. Hyper
Right.
partisanship stems from the top down. It stems from people like Mitch McConnell, people like Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Donald Trump. it
Yeah.
it's not just a bunch of woke members of Congress. It's people who have been there for 30 plus years, who have been like who have actually led us to this division that's in our country and this
Yeah.
ineffectiveness in Congress.
So there's a lot to unpack there. My thinking is there's a huge distinction between hyper partisanship and
Hmm.
sort of the chaos that is created by members who are unwilling to compromise, and more general dysfunction.
Okay.
And to a much more, broader point, if members like AOC and Ilhan Omar and sort of the rallying squad type of progressives, and even some of the moderates who are flipping seats, elections are about change if you're a challenger.
Yeah.
And AOC doesn't get elected in New York in 2018 if things are going well in Congress, right? I mean, I looked at that race and saw 2014 written all over it, and I was not surprised when she won because it was a very similar circumstance to the one that saw Eric Cantor lose his election in
Yeah.
2014, right? She's running against the banner of Washington, a man, Joe Crowley, who many thought would be Speaker of the House one day. He didn't spend any time in his district. He was outspending her and treating this like a walk in the park in a low turnout primary, which we can also talk about that as a totally side issue. But she said, "You're not here. No, you're part of a machine that doesn't work." And she managed to find a winning coalition there. And so she doesn't. If Congress is working well, there's no oxygen in the room for her.
Mm.
If you want to blame any new member of Congress for general dysfunction, I think you're missing the target of the people who are creating the rules that all of them are forced to play into. In a much more different sense, sort of the hyper partisanship, and I think when some reform people or organizations are referring to hyper partisanship, they're not even really talking about legislation. Because very rarely does a hyper partisan like piece of legislation just sail through without any issue. I think, if Joe Biden were to win the election and his first agenda was a socialized medicine sort of plan where he's like, hey, we're going to do Medicare for all, and we're going to get this done. And it's like everything that a Bernie Sanders sort of supporter would want to see. I think he'd have a really hard time getting that in through the Senate because he's not getting a single Republican vote. And I think a lot of Democrats would have issues with it too. So it's not like hyper partisan agenda legislation like sails through all the time. What they're talking about is more, and I think Amash talked about this too, is it's a performance.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people who saw Ed Markey and AOC introduce the Green New Deal, and it's not a piece of legislation. It's literally just like a wish list presented as, here's what we think should happen, and it's, I think, a resolution.
Yeah, it's more. So I would say it's more so like a resolution, like
the difference, right? Like I don't know how
it's a page long,
right? And I think a lot of people saw that and were like, "There's just no way that this is ever happening. If this is the wish list, most of these wishes are not coming true." Like the joke of it all was the elimination of, I think, reliance on cow.
But that was never actually stated in the resolution. If you read,
no, I know, but this was that's what I'm saying. So there was the sort of the fact, like the sheet that they produced, and then what they actually went to Congress with. There were two different documents.
Yep.
And Mitch McConnell, knowing that it was an unpopular piece of legislation that they wanted to vote on, it was, let's say it's a resolution, whatever, members are going to vote on it.
Mm-hmm.
McConnell and I guess it was at the time, I get my timeline mixed up, but I'm pretty sure the Republicans still had no, I guess they couldn't have. So I guess it was in the Senate. A vote was taken on the resolution, and most of the Democrats didn't participate in it because they're like, this is like, why are we, like, McConnell couldn't wait for them to vote on it. And so the problem is that it was never something that should have been turned into a resolution because most of the members weren't going to support it. It was purely for theater.
Right.
And I do think that the more sort of extreme members of Congress on both sides in both chambers, understanding that their actual legislative power is limited, have figured out how to be the loudest, a much more outsized voice in the room, right?
Mm-hmm.
And understand that for them, it's more about the performance and making sure that, their ideas are heard, not necessarily in the legislation they write and vote on, but in their, social media feeds or the interviews that they do.
Right.
And it helps them raise money, and it's a whole ecosystem that feeds off of it.
I see where you're coming from on the whole performance thing, right? But my thing is with the Green New Deal, I feel like that's a specifically the strategy behind that. Like that's a scenario where performance actually helps get the legislation more traction, more recognition. It's not necessarily like that one-page document's not going to change the world. It's not going to fix climate change. No, that's something help people understand. Oh, so Green New Deal, what's that? They'll go Google it. They'll go look it up or whatever. So it serves that purpose. So, and I think that's the purpose it was meant to serve. It wasn't meant to fix. If you ask AOC even right now, like is that document gonna fix climate change? Is that document going to address? No, she'll tell you no.
Right.
That's performance. I think that actually over time will help pass more legislation or help these ideas come out. But then there's other types of performance that are more dangerous. There's political theater that leads to people, becoming, economically destitute. An example of that would be the stimulus package talks that are going on right now. So
or lack thereof.
Or lack thereof. Unless you ask James Clyburn, who says there are talks going on and nobody who's not in the room is allowed to talk about them publicly. But no, let's actually talk about that. So so I believe Nancy Pelosi was in some hot water this week with a few of her Democratic people in her Democratic caucus, as well as political figures like Andrew Yang. And the crux of the argument or the criticism that she was getting was that we are less than 14 days away from an election. If something doesn't get passed now, we're likely going to have to wait till February to get money in the hands of the American people to get any sort of package passed. And that's just going to add to people suffering. And and when you look at it, it's a very logical message. It's not something that's overly critical, I would think, of her personally or the way things are going. It's just saying, let's just help as many people as we can right now. Because Mitch McConnell and the Republicans, for whatever reason, for me, I don't understand the actual strategy behind it. They don't want to spend any money. They don't really want. They're acting as if they don't really want to get anything passed before the election.
Right.
And So when you're working within those confines and looking at it strictly from the Democratic perspective, it would actually behoove Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats to at this point get anything passed. You're not going to be able to get every single person who needs help the help they need right now. That's just impossible at this point. Political realities prevent that from happening.
Yeah.
But like rent is due. If you can prevent someone, or even like let's say there's like 40 million people who are still suffering because of this pandemic from the economic strife. If you can get even 10% of those people, that's millions of people that you are helping. That's
Right.
millions of lives that are affected, families that are able to pay rent, stay in their houses. That and getting money in the hands of the American people is extremely important this time, because you can pass something that might not be perfect now if you're the Democrats, and then if you're very so confident about winning the House, winning the Senate, and winning the presidency in February, you can readdress some of those issues. You can
Right.
readdress, continuing payments. You can readdress, tax cuts and other things like that at a later date. So to me, the criticism is actually warranted, and I think that the Democrats and the party leadership is kind of lost in this political theater. They're just lost trying to play a political game at a time where we can't afford it.
Yeah, the cynic in me says that the strategy is Trump will get blamed for this, and that they don't want to give Trump's White House a win by giving people checks, days before an election. Forget the people who already voted. Like, it seems to be a sort of a standard operating procedure where in an election year, even in the best of times, you don't really want to take up, some of these landmark sort of proposals,
Mm-hmm.
because the person who signs it is the one who gets the credit, right?
Yeah.
And so, um, if there's reluctance or a sort of refusal, or at least a strategy of drawing out the negotiations for as long as they can possibly go to get the perfect deal, I think the Democratic strategy is election day will come and go. No one will have any, check in their bank account, and it'll be Trump's fault. And I mean, there's probably some merit to that. Um, I think one of the things that has become pretty abundantly clear, and it is in a way, something that helps Trump by and large, is that Washington and people who are super into the sort of Twitter political verse, who follow their favorite journalists and their members of Congress and are quick to respond, they're not very good at walking and chewing gum at the same time. What I mean by that is there are so many things that are happening in the world right now. There's only so much time that you have in your day to focus on this. Look, I do this for a living, and for example, I'm not going to watch the debate tonight. Like, I have another thing going on, and I'll watch the highlights if I'm so inclined for whatever reason. I think that Trump thrives in a situation where he's able to throw a lot into a lot of different places. And I think that that was a big part of his winning strategy in 2016, was just be absurd and force them to say as much awful shit about you as they possibly can, to the point where people are sort of shaking their heads and saying nobody could be everything that they're saying he's going to be. It doesn't help. It doesn't hurt that he's a celebrity too. I mean, we're a country that is obsessed with celebrity to the point where, Kanye West will be the first probably politician of significant celebrity status who doesn't win an election that he's on the ballot for. And you're seeing it with the stimulus issue too, right? I mean, they've been negotiating for months. They knew that a package was due, and months and months of negotiations gets derailed by what I'd been saying for months would be the one thing that would throw this election into even further chaos, which is Ruth Bader Ginsburg passes away. And all of a sudden, everyone just abandons the notion of stimulus. It becomes a Supreme Court confirmation hearing. And do they confirm her? Are the Republicans hypocritical for throwing in the nomination? Of course. Is it the president's responsibility to fill the vacancy? Constitutionally, yes. Like, everyone forgets that there are people who don't really care that much about the court when they're, trying to scrape mold off of a loaf of
Yeah,
bread.
and if you talk to people who are unemployed, or if you talk to people who are struggling to pay bills right now,
They don't care.
they really don't give a shit. They're asking for anything. One of the holds that allegedly the Democrats are, or one of the things that they're claiming is that the unemployment benefits isn't enough
Yeah.
for the people. But if you talk to people who are unemployed and who are on these benefits, they're saying, It doesn't matter whether it's $200,
Something.
$300, something. Anything is better than the nothing we're getting now, because
Yeah.
people are actually getting kicked out of their homes now, because a lot in some states the moratorium on evictions are up. The moratorium on evictions are up in a few areas, and people are
Yeah.
like starting to they're telling you to pack your bags and get out. So I just don't think we can afford, these kinds of games at this moment in time. It's just that we're talking about Amy Comey Barrett, who, if this was 30 years ago, half the country wouldn't even be paying attention to the Supreme Court nomination.
Mhm.
That's supposed to be something that just happens. And I think actually Amy Coney Barrett, if this was any other like time in history, if this was maybe 10 years ago,
Mhm.
I doubt she'd actually have that much trouble getting passed, because it's not like she's. Are there concerns about how she feels about Roe v. Wade and that kind of
Mhm.
stuff? Yes, but all in all, she's a very typical judge. The issue is something
Right.
like that also has been
Yeah.
polarized. And
You can't watch the Judiciary Committee hearing and think that there was ever, and this was the same thing with Kavanaugh, and it was largely the same thing with a lot of Trump's cabinet appointments.
mm-hmm,
It just seems like these members, with the exception of a few, have by and large made up their minds before ever saying a word to any of them. And I would be hard pressed to know or name any single member of the Democratic or Republican Senate who, the moment that the news broke that RBG had passed away, they knew without a shadow of a doubt that a judge was going to be rammed down their throat.
yep,
There's no question. And you can protest that as much as you'd like. I certainly understand the um, the ridiculousness of throwing in a Supreme Court confirmation hearing, a month before an election, especially after what happened to Garland, which you can't separate the two. But they all knew who they were. Like, they didn't even know who the name of the justice was. They already knew that how they were going to vote.
yeah.
Um, so it's just, I mean, it's hard to watch, and it's also hard to be super excited about anything of the status quo right now.
Right. So I think the question is, though, like, what can we do? Like, what are actual like political reform efforts we can do
Mhm.
to, fix this problem, to mitigate, these disasters that are happening in our political process in our country right now?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, unsurprisingly, there's quite a bit going on. A lot of it, was covered or were issues that Neil ran on the campaign that we did in 18, and a lot of other candidates of the independent movement, which you would call, like campaign-centered reforms. You could also look at structural reforms in the way that we both participate in elections, and also what happens when a member gets to Congress. Issues like ending gerrymandering, so that districts become more competitive and the politicians aren't choosing their voters, is a huge thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a supporter of opening up primaries to allow independents to participate in the primary process. Campaign finance is a huge piece of the puzzle, but that's always sort of the most dicey constitutional line to cross.
To me, that's probably the most important aspect of these reforms. Like, that's the most important reform to me, because
Mhm.
it just immediately, you are getting all of the special interest out of your politics. You're getting the whole reason that Amy Coney Barrett became such a polarizing and partisan issue, like her confirmation,
Mhm.
is because Republican donors, they wanted to get a Republican judge who is going to, or a conservative judge who's going to, vote in favor of a lot of these, like who's going to be more favor of conservative issues, and like that, and
Yeah,
that was a huge thing. That's why Mitch McConnell was working so hard on trying to convince people, and that's why he came out an hour after the announcement of RBG's passing and said that we're going to move forward with a nomination now.
I don't think that was donor driven. I like I said, look,
But
I've been for months. People were asking me what would be the most sort of damaging, or the thing that would throw everything into chaos leading up to the 2020 election. This was during COVID,
mhm,
right? So everyone's already dealing with that. And I said the one thing that would happen is if RBG dies and there's a Supreme Court confirmation battle, which the Republicans will 1,000% fill, whether it happens before the election or in a lame duck session. And it wasn't, unfortunately, it wasn't the hardest prediction to make, if only because she was an old woman with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It almost seemed like I wasn't in, I'm not in the Beltway, but it seemed to me a fairly sort of break glass in case of emergency scenario that I'm surprised that less people were sort of thinking about heading into the election, right? And the reason it was so obvious that she would be confirmed was because McConnell couldn't possibly allow, as someone specifically who's focused most of his career on, the court and has seemingly made that his only focus during the Trump presidency, and has done it fairly well. I mean, he's going to confirm 3 justices in the first 4 year, in a 4-year term. It's a lot.
Yeah.
He was never just going to say, all right, well, we kind of did this. We handicapped Obama and we stole one from Garland. So we should just give this back to Biden and the Democrats to appoint whoever they like, because there is a likelihood that they get the U.S. Senate, or at least a reasonable possibility.
Okay.
And let's just give Biden one. Let's just give him a justice. I don't think he'd ever have been even it would have been irresponsible of him to his political base and to his ideas and to his membership to punt on it. That doesn't mean campaign finance reform isn't a big issue. I'm just saying, it was, and in fact, in many ways, it almost ensured that the Democrats would raise a shit ton of money, because as soon as it became obvious that they were going to confirm, I'm sure quite a few candidates for Senate in some of these key states, like the Mark Kellys of the world, the Steve Bullocks of the world, John Hickenlooper, John Ossoff, Sarah Gideon in Maine,
Paula Jean Swearengin.
Right. I mean, even candidates you would have thought would have never. I mean, when we were looking at the U.S. Senate map, 2018, knowing that 2020 was going to be a much more difficult year for Republicans to defend, I think people were looking at Colorado, Maine, and Arizona as sort of the 3 most likely to flip. And I think a lot of people at the time were saying the Republicans are going to lose some of their majority, but they'll retain a majority, because Doug Jones will likely lose his seat in Alabama. You need a seat, there's an open seat or a contested election, in North Carolina, that seemed like it could go, but it was less likely the other 3. And now all of a sudden you're saying, well, hold on, is it possible that a Democrat is going to flip Alaska in Georgia, or 1 seat in Georgia?
Yeah.
I mean, the map has expanded incredibly rapidly.
So how much of that do you think is actually the map actually expanding, and how much of that do you think is just conjecture and just overanalyzing the times we're in?
No, I think it's expanded. I think some of the seats that we were looking at, by virtue of the incumbents having to navigate an unnavigable Trump world, we're sort of dead on arrival. I would be astonished if Cory Gardner is still a senator next session. I would be astonished if Martha McSally is still there. I think Susan Collins is always a wild card, but we'll see. And I'm not suggesting that, John Cornyn is going down or Dan Sullivan in Alaska is going down, but they're running against credible challengers who are polling pretty tight up on them. Mm-hmm. We've got Cal Cunningham in North Carolina. Jamie Harrison is probably the most impressive fundraiser out of all of them, and is giving Lindsey Graham a run for his money. Talk about someone who has been more damaged by the Trump presidency than Lindsey Graham.
Yeah,
I think they're tight, and they're made tighter not just because of the money that these candidates are raising, but because Democrats are energized. The traditional sort of election deciding swing voters or independent voters are breaking Biden's way pretty enormously. Mm-hmm. Turnout is going to be up huge, so the apathetic voter is down tremendously.
Yeah,
and that all, I still think the election is a jump ball. Certainly at the top of the ballot, but I would say that, it'd be like me taking a jump ball against, like Steph Curry. I mean, I have a size disadvantage.
You have a size disadvantage with Steph Curry. You must
not an athleticism disadvantage, but a size disadvantage for sure.
Tragic. I actually agree with you though about the map. I agree that it has expanded, and it's expanded a lot in just a very short amount of time. And
It happens quick.
when you consider things like the fact that 40 million Americans have already cast their votes, that
Yep.
is it's extremely powerful, because disproportionately we know that more Democrats tend to vote by mail than Republicans, and
Yep.
the messaging and a lot. And if you look at some of the states that have really who really like made this a huge part of their election, is they're mostly Democratic states, heavily Democratic states. So
Yep.
I think you are going to see that these Democratic candidates are going to do better, because one of the good things about COVID and the way it's affected our politics, it's led to more mail-in voting. It's led to, I think, an expansion and more awareness of the electorate.
Which I'm fine, by the way. Like
Just
I think it's fine to vote by mail. Um, you know, as I have less of an issue of confidence with the idea of voter fraud. I think that there's tons of evidence that shows that voter fraud, in sort of the traditional sense, is pretty overblown. Where I lack confidence is in two places: the board of elections in counties and in states. And I mean, the amount of, I don't have many white hairs in my head, but the amount that are there are actually exclusively attributable to the Maryland State Board of Elections from the petitioning process and the shit they put us through in 2018. But they're, in different states and in different places, a lot of the boards of elections operate with relative autonomy and are staffed by known partisans who will go out of their way to not mess with ballots. I'm not saying that they're tampering with votes, but I've seen some stuff even in New York City. And I went with someone to vote in 2017, and this person was a Republican. They didn't even have Republican ballots for this person in a primary.
wow.
Like, they were handing everyone Democratic ballots, and this person was like, "I'm a Republican," and they had to literally search the place for the polling site for the ballots that were wrapped still tightly in their sort of airtight plastic, crack it open and give it to the person I was with. And she was like, "There's no way I'm the first Republican to try and vote in this primary today. It's the afternoon. And there doesn't seem like you've done this many times, because you clearly have no idea what's going on here. So are you just giving everyone Democratic ballots?" And there was no answer. And on the way out, another person who had voted was like, "I just voted for the second time today." Like, she was probably joking, but the fact is, like, it's not about election fraud as it is the incompetencies of some of these people who are staffing the election agencies.
Mm-hmm.
My second bigger concern is with the U.S. Postal Service. And if you're interested, you can talk to our friend Aaron Mackesy, who is running as an independent for Warwick City Council up in Rhode Island.
Big shout out to Aaron Mackesy.
Yeah. You're in Warwick, Rhode Island, Ward 9. Make sure to vote down ballot and vote for an independent voice. That's the plug I'm doing in case you need it. And Aaron will pay you for that ad. But we've been fighting with the USPS for the last several days. Our advertising hasn't even, we sent it out a week ago and change, and it hasn't arrived yet. And they just found it just like stored in the mail house, undelivered. And so I've seen it in New York City, people getting ballots that were addressed to other people or things like that. That is concerning, if only because, clearly there are issues that need to be addressed. And so if you have to absolutely vote by mail, vote by mail. But at the end of the day, if you can drop off your ballot or get in line and do it traditionally, I think that's the best way to feel confident that your vote is being recorded. And if you're capable of doing it, go for it.
Agreed. Let's shift gears and briefly talk about the presidential election, which is going to be in the news quite a bit over the next 2 weeks. As the race stands now, again, take all polling with a grain of salt, as I've said over the past 3 months, but Biden has a pretty insurmountable lead, it looks like, in polling in both battleground states and in national polling.
Yep.
His national polling is almost double of where Hillary Clinton was at this point.
Mm-hmm.
He's leading in all the key states, and at this point, a lot of pundits saying that it's not a matter of if Biden wins or not, it's by how much. Yeah. And I think the question arises out of that is, is this lead this because he's not just leading in the polls, he's also leading in fundraising and in money and spending
Yeah,
money because Biden is spending a shit ton of money.
it's insane. I mean, each of these candidates, I think Trump and his associated PACs and the RNC together have $250 million to spend over the next 12 days. And Biden had his own campaign had 360 million to spend over 12 days, less the DNC or any sort of affiliated Biden super PACs. And first and foremost, 250 million is a lot of money. So Trump may have less, but there's only so many ways you can spend that amount of money in, over the course of a very, very short time horizon. What always drives me nuts, and I'll answer sort of the question about polls and speculation,
Right.
but I just feel like any person who is seeing the amounts of money that were raised by candidates, going all the way up to the end of the election and doesn't have their mind fucking blown in astonishment by where that money could have gone other than an election, doesn't that shock? I mean, think of how much money that the 2,200 Democratic candidates who ran for president this cycle,
not including Bloomberg. Let's just take Bloomberg and his billion out of there as well.
Bloomberg, who, I mean, that's pocket money for Mike. But yeah, you can include Bloomberg and then just take whatever the other candidates raised at $1 billion. But I mean, you think about Harris, Pete, Cory Booker, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, Yang, and then even some of the candidates who were out of the election so soon you would forget that they even ran, like the Kirsten Gillibrands of the world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they raised so much money to produce absolutely nothing except maybe get themselves a position other than the ones they currently hold.
Right.
I mean, Tom Steyer spent a shit ton. Like, think about what this money could have gone. You couldn't actually, but I'm sure a lot of people would have loved to see that money just thrown into a stimulus package. It's insane to me. On punditry and the polls,
of which you are one. You are officially a pundit now, in case you're wondering.
Hack.
Yeah, you're a liberal hack, just like Manu Raju.
I'm so excited. Yeah, that was one of those astonishing moments of many astonishing moments this cycle.
Yeah.
I always caution people that the polls are underreporting Trump people, and that the election was going to tighten. I mean, there are polls that I see that have Biden up double digits in places like Florida and Pennsylvania. There's no chance that that's an accurate read on the ground in PA. And more importantly, as the race tightens, the margins of error become significant.
Yeah.
So without knowing what the internals are, right? Biden, I've seen in some of these Pennsylvania polls, he's up. He's not clearing 50% of the vote in a lot of these polls. And you have Biden, let's say, 48, Trump 45, or Trump 46, with a margin of error of 3.5, 4 points. If you assume that the margin of error favors Trump, you actually have Trump in a dead heat or even up 1% or 2. And I'm not saying, like I said, I think the election's going to be close. I think it's by many accounts a jump ball that favors Biden. But I do think that if people read these polls, just like they did in 2016, and are assuming that this has already been in the bag, they're going to be very, very disappointed come election night, or whenever the elections, whenever the elections are actually, the results are actually announced, which I don't think will be for several weeks after the election.
Yeah, and it's going to be extremely, even if Trump loses, it's going to be extremely difficult to really weave through all of that when he probably, claims victory on election night. Because if you look at the messaging of the campaign and everything that's come out in the past few months, it's just, that's what this is leading to. They've said that the result on election night is the result that they're going to go with. And anything after that, they're going to challenge. And that really causes not just a constitutional, but a democratic crisis, I would think, for our country, because you have a sitting president who is essentially blocking the quote unquote peaceful transfer of power that's supposed to exist to another president. And this is, again, in the case that Donald Trump loses. We still don't know if that's going to happen. We're not going to find out until probably who knows how long from now, right? So
we'll probably enjoy Thanksgiving, or enjoy might be the operative word, but we'll be eating Thanksgiving dinner, probably with uncertainty over the election results.
Yeah,
and I think there'll be lawsuits as well. and I saw this in the Judiciary Committee hearings for Coney Barrett specifically,
Mm-hmm.
is, and again, this is going to come from the opposition. So in this instance, it's Democrats. I don't doubt if it was a liberal justice and Republicans had significant concerns that they would be posing the same sort of, this case is in front of you. What do you think? These jurists shouldn't, they should be talked about the way they consider law and the way they consider their previous cases and the way they think through these issues. But if you want a verdict delivered to you on a silver platter, you're sweeping the legs out of the judge before they're even seated and robed. So I understand I think the concern that Coney Barrett ruling on a case that could decide the presidency, a month after she is sort of confirmed by the most unfortunate sort of standards and literally thrust upon the country to decide this case. I think there's a reasonable concern that she isn't necessarily, that she feels a sort of allegiance or whatever it is to Trump. I understand the concern. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, but I don't want to go through let's count the numbers and say Kennedy and Breyer are in this bucket, and we know Roberts could be a swing vote, because I feel like it's all conjuncture and it gets people even more ramped up. I hope it doesn't get to the Supreme Court, because it'll be more craziness.
I get why you would think that, and in a perfect world, I would actually agree with you. The issue is that even
there's not enough bourbon in the world for it, man.
Yeah, but the issue is the Supreme Court itself, dude, is a political machine now. It's not the institution, this respected independent institution that it was supposed to be, or that people thought it was just 15 years ago. It serves political purposes. So that's why I don't want to rule out just going over the scenarios, because these are scenarios that could affect our election, and it's not
Oh, I get it. It's just
my thing is I'm not trying to scare people. I'm not trying to do that. It's good to really flesh through these issues and really think about them, because then you get a clearer understanding of where the overall situation stands. The other thing that plays into this, not just Supreme Court, is voter fraud and how that's going to play into it. The other issue is mail-in votes. Are they going to get lost? Are they going to get not delivered in some cases in some key states, as we've seen? So Supreme Court is just part of a bigger bucket.
It'll happen the way it happens.
Mm-hmm.
I really hope, and this is sort of why I try not to sort of engage in speculative jurisprudence, is my thinking is I really hope that these judges, who, yes, they're appointed, it's a partisan confirmation process more now than it's ever been, but I really do hope they take their legal training and their thinking super seriously, and are arriving and looking at the evidence of the cases, and are essentially treating their cases in a way that is totally and fundamentally different than the way they were actually voted on in the confirmation hearings, right? And I do think you've seen it from, Justices Gorsuch, and you've seen it from Roberts, certainly, that there is a sort of, some of the speculation about their confirmations turned out to be sort of disproven by some of their more recent actions. But I remember when Gorsuch was thrown up, I mean, people were protesting his nomination before they even knew who he was. That seems to be standard practice now. And as soon as they really got to repeat what they heard, which is, again, a big problem in our civics, and we can talk about that also, people having thoughts before they even know what to think about. But they were protesting Gorsuch and his legal career without really analyzing it, and came to the conclusion that he was going to be this conservative stalwart, and a conservative political figure, as opposed to a sort of a conservative jurist.
Mm-hmm.
And he's proven them wrong in many instances. So I would hope that that they take that to heart and understand the seriousness of the verdict that they end up giving, in the event that the election is decided largely by a Supreme Court decision.
Yeah.
Other than that, I just get like I said, there's not enough bourbon in the world to think about how 9 people are gonna decide.
One thing that I did want to talk to you about is voter awareness, and kind of because this is also important, just in general, not just specifically this election, but elections going forward. A lot of people in this country are kind of made to think that there's only really 2 ways to go about where you vote and the issues you stand on, and that's really trickles down from our politics. But how important is it for voters to actually know what their vote means and the issue that they're voting on? And what are some ways that they can actually become more
Yeah,
aware voters?
my rule, and it's always been my rule, I will not vote on an election where I don't have an opinion, of the candidates that I'm voting for. So if I have no preference or I'm not familiar with any of the candidates, and that's happened, typically it's down ballot races, judges, things like that. And I try to be as informed as I can. I won't vote.
Right.
I think the notion of casting a ballot intentionally when you don't know who and what the figures are or the consequences are, I think is pretty civically irresponsible. And so what I tell people who sort of are asking me questions is I actually hate the question of like who am I going to vote for, because it shows that you're just basically treating me like a pundit, and if I tell you to vote for and you do it, I'm like, why are you casting a ballot in the first place? But the sample ballots are always a good place to start. You can look up where you live, you look up what they have the entire ballot with all of the names, and then you do your homework and you do your due diligence. And um, I think if people really invested in voting sort of the way that they invest in talking about politics and becoming like a self-proclaimed expert on politics, we would be a lot better off, because you're at least sort of rooting out maybe some of these people who are elected in very very, very narrow margins, where someone either doesn't vote or voted for a candidate they knew nothing about and ends up regretting the outcome.
There's actually this website called votesaveamerica.com that will
Yeah,
actually tell you every single thing that's on your specific ballot. You just have to type in your zip code, your address, and
exactly, right.
it'll tell you everything from all of the different amendments, all of the different ballot initiatives that are on your ballot,
Yeah.
to the main party candidates that are running for your congressional district, or even third party candidates. So that's a good tool. That's votesaveamerica.com. I'll link it in the description below. Check that out. That's like things like that. They help people become, more aware
Yeah.
voters, because the reality is, like, someone like me, I'm going to be honest with you. I still haven't made up my mind about exactly who I'm going to vote for in this election. And
Yeah.
before Resistance Democrats and the K Hive come at me, I'm not voting for Trump. So I've made up my mind about who I'm going to vote for. And, I'm considering either voting for the Green Party candidate, Howie Hawkins, or Joe Biden, who's the Democratic candidate. And it's weird that in Maryland I kind of have the luxury, for lack of a better term, to think about voting for Green Party in this election, or because it's a heavily Democratic state. It's likely going to go to Biden anyway. So me taking one vote away from Biden and voting for the Green Party isn't really going to make an impact on whether or not he wins.
Hmm.
So voting in Maryland is different than someone who's in Wisconsin or Michigan
Right.
or Pennsylvania voting for Biden, because the margins are way too close there. If you're a Democrat, for Biden to take away votes from him. That's also something I've had a problem with, though. So it's something I'm still actually like trying to flesh out and trying to figure out, is this
Yeah.
issue of, taking away votes. I don't like saying that, because, voters aren't a monolith. Voters don't vote for a party because they represent every single thing that they stand for. They vote
Right.
for who they want to and who best represents them. For some people, that's Howie Hawkins. For some people, that's Joe Jorgensen. For some people, that's Trump, Biden, etc. So I don't know. I just think that I think Americans take like who you vote for and where you stand on these issues a little too seriously. I think it's okay for us in politics to do that, because it's kind of our jobs to take it seriously. But I think we take these things, we take like if you're someone who's just an ordinary person, you're running a small business or whatever, you work a
Hmm.
9 to 5, and you make everything a political battle, every like little thing, and you don't talk to any Trump supporters, you don't talk to any Biden supporters or whatever. I think that leads to really deteriorates at our political conversation and our discourse overall.
Yeah. I you know, there a few things came up during that. During
Rant.
it wasn't a rant, but it was. I think a couple. You touched on a few points that I would add to. And the first is, in the list of reforms that I think a lot of people are aggressively pursuing in the reform universe. Ranked choice voting is a huge piece of that puzzle, and it is such a valuable tool for people in positions like you or me, where I'm in New York City, my vote will in a electoral vote or a popular vote context, no matter either, they're both going overwhelmingly Democrat anyway, and so it gives sort of a sad sense of my vote doesn't matter. RCV sort of changes. I don't know if it would change the outcome of an election, at the national level in those two states, but it does ensure that you could vote for a Green Party candidate, and assuming they don't hit the 15% threshold, it goes to your second choice, and sort of no harm, no foul.
Yeah.
But the biggest sadness that I find among sort of the civic issue of just engagement in politics is most people, I think, have decided that it's become culturally acceptable to sort of badger people about, or even ask people who they're going to vote for. And I was never in my lifetime, or in my political life at least, but I was told by people who remember this fondly that there used to be a very taboo association of asking someone who they were going to vote for. If you went up to someone that you knew well and said, who did you vote for? They would look at you like you were a lunatic. Like
Right.
It was just not done. And I think that it's sad we've gotten away from that, because it's all about, people judging you on your decision on how to cast a ballot the way you casted a ballot, and it's supposed to be a private thing. It's different for public servants. Like if you're asking Mitt Romney who he voted for, I think it's a reasonable question. It's very different from someone who didn't volunteer it. If you said you may vote green, you're opening up the door to have that conversation. But people should be, debated on their ideas, not necessarily on who they cast a ballot for. And like you said, people vote for different reasons, and it's not really right of me to judge you for, what led you to the decision to cast your ballot. I remember I was in New York City. It was in 2016. I was at some bar on the Lower East Side, and my friend and I were at the bar getting a drink, and we were talking about something political. And this young woman came up to me and sort of inserted herself into this conversation. And my friend and I are both sort of like-minded in that we're generally pretty moderate people. We've voted for both Democrats and Republicans, at different levels of our life and at different ballots. And so I had mentioned, she had asked me essentially, I don't really care what you think as long as you're voting for Hillary Clinton. I was like, and I have no problem admitting I voted for Clinton in 2016. And I said, yeah, sure, no problem. I'm not looking for a fight anyway, but it's the truth. And she said, well, how do you feel about it? Are you super excited about that? I said, I'm a registered independent. The decision wasn't particularly hard for me to make. And yet I'm not going to pretend like I'm a Clinton cheerleader just because I voted for the person you wanted me to vote for. And I have certainly disagreements and issues with some of the things that she thinks and does. So no, I don't feel like I've done the country an active service that is worthy of gratitude because I voted for the person you like. And she threw a drink in my face. So it comes back to the idea. Look, I remember one of my favorite quotes is from a comedian who are, in my view, the only people who make sense anymore. I love stand-up comedy. There's a comedian I love named Bo Burnham, who you may know.
Love Bo Burnham.
And in his most recent special, he sort of just ad-libs, or at least threw in a line that was sort of a non sequitur kind of comment. But he's like, I don't really do political comedy, because I only know my thoughts about other people's thoughts. And that really struck me, because I think a lot of people are in that boat where they only know what they think about what other people think. And then take it a step further, and in the comedian sense, he's making jokes about, things that he doesn't really have an informed opinion on. But people are letting that dictate quite a bit of their life, the way they behave, the way they talk to other people, the way they think about certain issues, the way they engage with people online, the way they vote, the way they shop, all of this stuff. And if your only thinking is what other people think, it's a very, very dangerous slope towards, groupthink and mass manipulation. And so in terms of civics, my two biggest points are, one, I hope we get to a point where we're thinking freely for ourselves and really trying to think our own thoughts about other people's thoughts. And more importantly, we're not judging people for their thoughts on other people's thoughts. You know what I mean? It's kind of two sides of a very needed coin.
Jared Alper, a pleasure to have you on. My final question for you, though, is we're under 2 weeks away from the election. Over 40 million people have already voted, but there's a considerable amount of people who are probably going to vote on election day. If you could tell someone who hasn't made up their mind one thing right now, what would it be?
What I would say to someone, I don't think I know anyone who hasn't already made up their mind. I know plenty of people who haven't voted. But I think I would say to someone who truly didn't know how to vote and was sort of, they knew why they didn't know how to vote. I think that's kind of a difference. Like there are some people who really just are unengaged and therefore don't really know. But someone who's sort of struggling with it, I would just think of, what they want the next 4 years of their country to look like. Not just politically in terms of what happens in Washington, but what they want to see, changed or done differently, and vote for the candidate that they think, one, has the intention to change those things, or keep them the same if that's what your issue is, and also has the capacity to execute on those things. Talk is pretty cheap, and I think we need to start thinking about getting in people who are much more interested in the do than the talk.
Profound words by Jared Alper. Jared, where can the people find you? Is there any cause you want to shout out?
Well, you can find me on Twitter if you want to read a very boring sports or political Twitter feed. It's at Jared Alper. I'm happy to engage anytime. Just come with your own thoughts.
Jared, it's a pleasure talking to you. Can't wait to have you on again in the future. Take care, man.
You too.
And thank you guys for listening. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Tell your friends if you like the episode. Share it with them to help the show grow. And stay tuned for some very special episodes next week covering everything leading up to the 2020 election. Until next time, I'm Omer, and this has been Omer 2020.